Hello and welcome back to another episode of Focus on K-12, EdTech, and the Education Experience. I'm your host, Doug Konopelko, Education Strategist and National Esports Manager for CDWG. Today I talk with Dr. Sabba Quidwai, an educator, a leader, and a researcher with a passion for design thinking. We discuss how to be more intentional with our work in education as it surrounds design thinking. Let's dive in.
My name is Sabba, and I started my career as a high school social science teacher. And in 2011, I got a cart of iPads, which really kind of prompted me to go deeper into looking at how technology can enhance teaching and learning. And it wasn't long into that work where I realized that until we don't start changing sort of like the pedagogical side of things, and we don't start looking at the culture of teaching and learning and just some of the structures that we have in place, that we're not really going to be able to maximize the full potential of the technology we have. And I was, thinking a lot about that. And in 2014, I believe, I read The Second Machine Age by Eric Brynjolfsson and Andrew McAfee. And like the last line of their book says, "Technology is not destiny. We shape our destiny." And that sort of led me down this rabbit hole of like, okay, like how do we not only how we as adults shape our destiny, but how do we prepare young people to shape their destiny? And that's really what led me to design thinking. And so now I spend my time researching schools that are using design thinking and sharing their stories on my podcast.
Great. So let's start by giving folks who may not be as familiar a little breakdown or a brief synopsis of what we're talking about when we say design thinking.
Absolutely. So when we talk about design thinking, and I think different people have different definitions, but the way I like to think about it is it's both a method and a mindset to approaching both challenges and opportunities. And so I think a lot of times when we look at design thinking, we focus on like, how do we solve problems? But it's also like, hey, there's something I want to explore. I'm curious about how we could go down this pathway or how we might be able to do something that I have an idea about. Design thinking really gives you the framework for being able to have those conversations while nurturing your mindset in areas like creative confidence, I think is the biggest one. Like IDEO actually do a really great job of listing out sort of like the 7 mindsets. And, one of them is like creative confidence, just nurturing that creativity within you. Not creativity how we may think traditionally, like painting, drawing, music, art, which is obviously also important. But in this context, it's creativity in terms of taking an idea that you have and making it actionable and being able to execute on that idea and having the confidence to do so. Being able to be more comfortable with ambiguity, being able to develop empathy in a larger context, being able to iterate, to be optimistic. So it's both the method and it's the mindset that you gain as a result.
So how can we be more, intentional with it, using it more as like a framework rather than as, I think some folks use it almost as just like an engagement gimmick, right? Or because it's a buzzword, right? They're filling out their buzzword bingo card and design thinking was on there. So how do we use it more intentional, more as a framework or some examples of that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, everybody starts somewhere. I remember when I was doing the interviews with the learning experience designers, that's what they call their teachers at Design 39 over in San Diego. She said, in year one, we were doing design thinking projects like, oh, today we're going to do this design thinking project. And over time, it became just an embedded part of their culture. And she's like, design thinking then became a part of everything it is that we did. So you no longer really say like, I'm doing design thinking. Like I said, you develop those mindsets, you develop those frameworks for having conversations and approaching certain things you're dealing with. And so I think everybody starts like at some place, right? Like we all have to start somewhere. It's how we evolve, I think, that's important. And so one of the things that I always kind of recommend to people is start first with yourself. So I think a lot of times we're really excited to take this to the classroom, to take this to our students. And, the goal is, yes, we're definitely going to get there. But I think if we're going to get to the students and really transform their learning experience well to where it's sustainable and we're able to scale the work that we're doing, it starts by looking at the culture of leadership, the culture of faculty and staff, how they're working together, what they're doing. Because, it's funny, this was another thing that came up a lot in the interviews was this is something that every single person interviewed said, They said prior to coming and working at Design 39 in this, like, so they work as collaborative teams. They're not working in silos. She said, they said, I always felt like I was on an island by myself. And it didn't matter how supportive my leadership were. It didn't matter how much it is I wanted to do. I hit a wall on how much I could do as an individual working alone. Whereas when we work collaboratively with other people, you're great at something, I'm great at something, and now we're able to pool those strengths together, do work, as in their words, that energizes us, and that ultimately allows us to kind of scale these experiences. Otherwise, they feel very, very, very overwhelming. So I always recommend people start with examining kind of just their culture, kind of examining the ways in which adults are collaborating and how adults are working together, and using design thinking to have those conversations. And then once that group now has developed that skill set, let them be the ones. Like, that's ultimately, right, what educators are. Like, there was another thing that came up in the interviews where they said educators are inherent design thinkers. Like, design thinking is what you do. It just gives you some different language around work that you're already familiar with. And so I think if you use design thinking practices to really allow for faculty to come together, to collaborate, work well, break down those silos that exist where I'm teaching in my own classroom and everyone's doing their own thing, it allows that group then to be empowered to design for learners.
Yeah, I love when you're talking about the culture in there being so important, right? And the culture, and goes to that sort of the first step there, right, which is empathy, right, and understanding where people are and how they're feeling. And I can definitely, speaking from my own experience, when we talk about going through that process and the first few times you're introduced, you're following, like, here are the steps of a design thinking process, and we're going to solve this problem together. And I found that, what we always skipped when we first started was that first step, right? Which is empathy, which, I think happens a lot. So why do you think folks skip that first step or first couple steps when they're thinking about using design thinking or when they're putting it into practice?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. One of the things I learned over the years, right, just kind of connecting culture and empathy, is that cultures of innovation start with cultures of empathy. So when we really take the time, and I think that's the answer to your question, is it's time. When we do take the time to step back and say, what are people scared of? But what are people excited about? What worries people? What scares them? How do I learn more about the challenges that they're dealing with? But also balance that with what are they really wanting to do? I get a much better understanding of the people that I'm working with. One of the people I interviewed on my podcast, she's a former educator, Bree Goff, and now she works more on the corporate side doing design work. She said people don't change, people don't fear change, they fear loss. And I think the more you know about the people that you're serving, the better your narrative is about why you're doing what you're doing. And I think when you know people more, you have a better understanding of the people that you're working with, both the adults and the young people. If we're talking specifically about schools, I think you're better able to create a narrative that allows everybody to feel like they're invested in this mission. And I think too often there's that gap, right? It's like you have the why, or like the initiative that comes from the top down. And no one really, like, everyone just thinks like, oh, that's just another thing. It's going to pass by. Like, let's let that slide. And so there's no investment in that mission, and because it's not coming from the bottom up. And so I think time is the biggest one. I think also fear. I think people are afraid, like, oh my God, if I open this door to these questions, what am I going to get? And then how am I going to have to respond? Because like you, I can't tell you how many like leadership meetings I've sat in on where we're like empathizing with the student, like thinking about, well, what is the student like? What does the student do? But there's no student present. And so it's really just, then our opinion at that thing, or just like, what we think. And that's exactly what design thinking and that empathy stage is designed to do, is to break us away from what we think. Like I always say, like when you engage in empathy, what you think is often challenged by what you learn. And so I think there is a bit of fear that if I learn this, am I then going to have to apply it? Is that going to mess up our plan? And, we're just so go, go, go that I think a lot of times we're scared to pause and just say, okay, let's take a deeper look at, are we doing the right thing? Are we making the right choices? are we solving the right problems in the interest of the people we serve? And I think what people find is when they do take that pause, they actually get to move much faster, get to scale more initiatives, and your initiatives become sustainable. So I think the pause, the time, it's just things that we're not taught to do, that are not the norm. And I think design thinking does that. It challenges the way we traditionally think. It challenges the way we engage in problems and opportunities. It challenges how we think about conversations. And so there is an element of things being uncomfortable, which is why I think having like a facilitator or having somebody there to help navigate that can be a huge bridge from the unknown to feeling more confident and developing that skill set.
I'm drawn to the example you gave about saying, people might be uncomfortable with what they uncover, right? And what they might have to do once they learn through that empathy phase. And I think that, that's something that I go back to your point with the leadership work all the time. I sit down with a, school district leader or a school leader, and we're talking about something like data analytics, right? And talking about, are we going to do this platform and we're going to get all this information? And I always like to press pause there and say, like, if this yields something that's a really uncomfortable change for you as an organization, are you going to do it? And if you're not prepared to make the change based on what you learn, then don't go through the process of learning it, right? Because it's not enough just to know that it's happening, right? You've got to be prepared as an organization, as a school, as a district, whatever, to act on that information.
Yeah. And what we should also add in there, like I will say 99.9% of the time, people are so pleasantly surprised by what they learn. Like I recently was chatting with a superintendent of a really large urban school district. And he said before the school year started, he's like, I was so hesitant to open it up to do these student forums where he was, asking really great questions to inform how they were going to open, this school year that we're in right now. And he messaged me and he said, I was so nervous and I was so scared about what I was going to get. He's like, it's the best thing I ever did. And I think anybody who speaks to young people is so taken aback. I know I am time and time again by their articulation, by their empathy, by their ideas. Listening to what it is they want is probably the most energizing experience you'll ever have.
So you mentioned Design 39. Talk to me maybe a little bit about some other schools or districts or organizations you think are either successfully integrating design thinking into their practice or even just the empathy side, right, of what we just talked about into their work.
Yeah, absolutely. So with Design 39, I always, they've got it integrated across their campus. It's been many, many years of struggle. They've gotten to a great place. It's still an ongoing struggle. Like collaboration is always something where people are working on, but it's a really great example. The thing that I love about what they do over there is the way they have really broken the silos for their educators. They have given them the time and space. They figured it out. How do you give teachers the time and space to not just meet for 1 hour every other Wednesday as a PLC, but every single day to give them that consistency in designing collaboratively. I think the other example that I'm also really excited by is one in Colorado. It's called the PSD Futures Lab. And again, part of a public school district, it's a pathway designed for high school students, where there's actually multiple pathways that students choose based on their interests. But the way in which the design thinking elements are integrated in between, you really see a strong connection between like the social emotional concepts that we talk about, like self-awareness, great decision making, all of those like elements that CAS will have identified, and the experiences they've designed at the Futures Lab. And I love it because the kids, like one of the pathways is like business development and marketing, and the kids will develop like their own logos, their own business ideas. And then they'll go on LinkedIn and sort of build out their professional profile and then get feedback from people like, I'm designing this, I'm working on this, what's your feedback? So not only are they getting that mindset and developing those skills, they're also getting that like professional networking, like building that social capital, which is so important for young people in being able to access certain opportunities. So that's one that I really love. They have a great podcast that they do as well. So that's the Futures Lab at Colorado. The other one I really enjoy watching is, I think it's called the American School in Singapore. I believe it is, or a Singapore American school. But David Lee is sort of like their director of educational technology there. And I kid you not, on his Instagram, and he has a great YouTube channel as well. Every single day, he is sharing such inspiring lesson ideas for how they're doing this work, for how they're integrating it. So that's another really great practice, or another great school that has some of these practices. There's so many examples. And if anyone's listening to this and thinking like, hey, we're doing this, like I would love to share. I am looking right now for those stories, for those schools. So definitely feel free to share or hit me up and let me know the work it is you're doing. And we'd love to be able to showcase that in the future.
Sabba, I can't believe we're almost there already. We're almost finished. But, for folks who do want to learn a little bit more, get involved, what are some resources, blogs, books, or some people that maybe you heavily rely on that our listeners could connect with?
Yeah. So I would say if you want everything all in one place, the podcast, Sprint to Success, is literally where I go and interview the people that I want to learn from. So earlier I mentioned Eric Brynjolfsson from the Second Machine Age. I had a chance to interview him. It's one of the best interviews I've ever done. It's definitely a must listen. But I also interview a lot of people from the design thinking space, all the people that I want to learn from, that I want to grow with. So I would say if you're interested, askmissq.com, check out the podcast. I would say the one book I really like to recommend is called Sprint. How to go from idea to action in just 5 days. I think if you're somebody who's interested in design thinking, or you've kind of experimented with it a little bit, I think the Sprint frameworks and ideas will really help you up level and think about design thinking in a completely different way. And then the third one I'll share is a tool called Mural, Mural. And Mural have a template library that is filled with design thinking resources that people have contributed to. So if you like a resource, you like a framework, you can actually find the person and you can follow more of their work as well. So those are sort of like my 3 favorite places.
Sounds great. Well, thank you so much for sharing some resources with us, sharing your stories with us today on the show.
You are so welcome. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us today on Focus on K-12 EdTech and the Education Experience. If you enjoyed today's show, please feel free to like, subscribe, and click the little bell so that you get notified whenever we post a new episode. Or reach out to me on Twitter @dconopelco. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time as we focus on K-12.